Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to create the patch you just heard on the Prophet Rev2. I think it contains some interesting sound design options and is a lot of fun to play with and perform. Of course, its most prominent feature is this shifting rhythmic pattern. And for those of you who are mostly interested in achieving this effect, I'm going to show you a super quick example. On an initialized patch, set the low pass filter cutoff to 0. Select the first LFO and assign it to the cutoff. Set the amount to full and change the LFO1 shape to reverse saw. Set the frequency to around 60 and enable key sync, and we get this. Select the second LFO and set its destination to LFO1 frequency. Set its amount to 0, leave the shape to triangle, enable key sync, and set its frequency to around 20. Now when we introduce the amount, we get this effect. With that out of the way, we're gonna go slow and go step by step through the entire patch creation process, and I'll explain all of the different features and choices along the way. With the original patch, I programmed a sequence on the sequencer to experiment with the sound design, and I think that's a good starting point, so that's where we'll start as well. Then we'll dive into this shifting rhythmic pattern again using the two LFOs. Next, we'll look into ways to make this sound more interesting so that it evolves over time. And finally, I'll show an alternative approach to achieving this shifting rhythmic pattern by using the third envelope. So let's get started. We'll start by creating an initialized patch, and on the desktop model for the Prophet Rev2 you can do this by holding the buttons for LFO1 and 4 and pressing the hold button. So we're going to be looking at the sequencer. The Rev2 features two sequencer modes, poly, which is your standard way of sequencing multiple notes or chords over a number of steps, and a gated sequencer mode, which can be used for modulating certain parameters using a sequencer. We'll be using the first one, the poly mode, so we'll just leave it at that. My original patch featured 4 chords that last very long so that you can hear this shifting rhythmic pattern, and I'm just gonna program the same 4 chords for this example. So we'll start by pressing record, and we can just enter the 4 chords. And when we press play, we get this. Of course, this was not the result we were hoping for, and I did this on purpose so that we can look into different ways of achieving long sounding chords. First off, the sequencer is synchronized to the clock, and the default BPM is 120, so what if we set it to its lowest value, which is 30? We want the chords to be held even longer, so we can look at the clock divide option, which allows you to set the time signature, or in other words, the length of every step in the sequencer. By default, this is set to a 16th note, but we can change it to a different option, like a half note, which is the longest option. And we get this. I think we're aiming for the notes to be held even longer, like double the time, but there's no lower clock division option and the BPM is at its lowest value. And also when we're playing the sequence, we can hear that half of the time the chord is playing and the other half is just silence. So clearly we should be looking at an alternative approach, but the reason I'm showing you this is to give you an example of the type of effect you'll get if you try this approach. The alternative is to use ties, which means you can tie 2 notes in the sequencer together. So you would just enter 1 chord, press the tie button, and the chord will sound for 2 steps of the sequence. So let's increase the BPM to 60. The default is 120, but for some reason I used 60 in my original patch. And we'll set the clock divide to a quarter note, and now we will need to record the chords again and use ties. We will use 8 steps of the sequencer for each chord, so we will just record one chord and then press the tie button 7 times. Let's check it out. Now I must admit I don't usually use the sequencer for the Prophet Rev2 because it's kind of hard to work with and it's just much easier to use an external sequencer for sequencing notes. But I thought it would be useful for you to just see how it works and how to get long sounding chords. Alright, that's it for part 1. Let's save this patch by pressing right twice. Alright, let's dive into this shifting rhythmic pattern, as I like to call it, by going step by step. Set the filter cutoff to around 50% and select the first LFO and assign it to the cutoff and set the amount to full. Now set the shape to reverse sawtooth and press play. Whoops, let's choose a lower frequency, around 50. So as you could hear at the start, the 4 notes of the chord were kind of played out of sync. And then later when I increased the frequency, they got back into sync, but what's going on? So this is happening because the Prophet Rev2 features LFOs per voice. This means that whenever I press a key, an LFO will be assigned to this specific note. Enabling key sync can help us a little bit in this regard. What it means is that whenever you press a note, whenever you press a key, I should say, the LFO starts at the start of its shape. So for example, now we've selected the reverse sawtooth, which has this shape. And the start of its shape is the top of the gain that it's sending out, basically. And then over time it will go to its lowest point. So if we enable this and just play a few notes, you hear it always starts at the top, right? If I disable this, you can hear that not for every note I played, it started at the start of the LFO. So what does this mean for chords exactly? Well, if I play a chord and don't have key sync enabled, it will sound like this. If I enable key sync instead, this will happen. However, this doesn't mean that if I play other notes after playing a chord, that they will be in sync with the previously played chord, funnily enough. So I can do this. So there's actually no way to get the LFO in sync for every note you play. That's just because this synthesizer uses LFOs per voice. There's no setting that allows you to switch it to a global LFO. Unfortunately, that's just not possible with this synthesizer. However, for this example, of course, we've programmed our sequence, so when we press play again, it should always sync the 4 notes of the chord that are being played. Alright, on to the second LFO. Of course you saw me manually tweaking the frequency of the first LFO, but now we'll use the second LFO to do this automatically. Select the second LFO and set the destination to the frequency of the first LFO. And lower the amount. Leave the LFO shape, set a triangle, and set the frequency to around 20. Let's try this. So also in this case you could hear that it wasn't in sync when it was changing the frequency of the first LFO for the first chord. And this means that also for the second LFO we have to enable key sync. This rhythm sounds different from what I'm used to hearing in my original patch. So I'm just gonna play a little bit with the two frequencies. I think the frequency of the first LFO should be higher, maybe something around 80. And the second LFO should be around 20. Let's hear it. Yeah, this sounds better. By the way, I'm attaching a list of values you can use for this patch. However, this time I didn't write them down beforehand, and I'll just write down what we end up with and add that to the video description. So there are a few more things that are interesting to try out and experiment with regarding this shifting pattern. The first is to try disabling the key sync for the second LFO after you've started the sequence. It doesn't always work immediately, but you can try it out a few times. So I'll show you what I mean. So I hope you could hear that for chord 2 and 3 of this sequence, the LFOs were starting at a different position for the second LFO. And this resulted in the pattern being faster at the start of the chord. So typically, like when I press play now with key sync enabled, I know that it's going to start with a slow movement, like ding, 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 ding. I'll show you. But if you have key sync disabled, it might start at the faster part. Because it's not synced to the keys. Of course, a totally different thing we could try is to switch back to the first LFO and try a different shape for the LFO. Let's try square. Or triangle. So if you've seen my other Prophet Rev2 tutorial videos, then you've probably seen me use the same technique of one LFO influencing the frequency of a different LFO, because this shifting pattern I think is very interesting. It's sort of unpredictable and it adds a lot of movement to your patch. And of course, on a subtractive synth, the filter cutoff is one of the most effective parameters you can modulate. But try to experiment with different parameters you can modulate. For example, I've created a patch previously where I was modulating the mix of the effect on a reverb effect, and by using the same technique with the LFOs. And it got into really interesting territories. There's a lot of stuff to experiment with. Once you've set up LFOs like this, just try changing the destination to see what will happen. There's one more thing I wanted to mention, which is clock sync. If you have one LFO modulating the frequency of a different LFO, then the LFO that is being modulated, in this case LFO1, should have clock sync disabled. That's because when you do enable clock sync, the modulation will be ignored. I'll show you. And with it disabled, so if it's not working for you for some reason, make sure that clock sync is disabled for the LFO that is being modulated by another LFO. Alright, this next part is gonna be about everything but the shifting pattern, basically. I want to look into ways to make this sound more interesting while the chords are playing, to have it evolve apart from the shifting pattern with the LFOs. So to follow my original patch, we'll change the oscillator shape to triangle and set the shape mod to 0. And we'll add the second oscillator and also set it to triangle with a shape mod of 0. And set the oscillator mix at 50%, which is 64. Let's play this. And one thing I did in my original patch is to tune the frequency of the second oscillator, so the pitch, tune it up by 1/5, which means changing it from a C2, which is the default, to a G2. And I'll change the oscillator mix to 0, so we only hear the first one, and gradually introduce the second oscillator. I like how this sounds because it feels like you're layering another chord on top of the original one. And something very interesting happens when you introduce audio modulation for the filter with these two oscillators combined with this specific tuning. And I'll show you, but first I'll turn down the amount for the first LFO so we no longer get the shifting rhythmic pattern. And set the cutoff at around 50%, set the oscillator mix to 50%, and introduce the audio modulation. Let's set the cutoff a little bit higher. So the audio modulation of the filter is an interesting parameter to play with while you're doing a performance of this patch. I'm not gonna hook it up to some other type of automatic modulation like an envelope or an LFO, but I'll play with it later on. So right now this is still sounding quite dull. Let's look at some ways to make this sound more interesting. I'll start by adding pitch modulation to both LFOs. And first I'll turn up the oscillator mix so we can hear them both and set the cutoff to max. Make sure the LFO amount for the first LFO is still set to 0 so we don't get the shifting pattern. Select the third LFO and set its destination to the oscillator frequency for all oscillators. And now we can set the frequency for the third LFO to around 30, I'm just guessing, and introduce the amount. Okay, that sounds cool. In this case, I also recommend enabling key sync so that you really get this vibrato type effect where all oscillators and all voices are going in sync. We can also introduce some oscillator slop to make the oscillators drift a little bit. And now let's introduce the pan spreading for the voices in the amplifier setting, which will pan the voices sort of randomly within the stereo spectrum. And this panning sounds pretty cool, so maybe we can even modulate the panning by using an LFO, and we'll pick the fourth one, set the destination. Actually, we can just hold the LFO 4 button and turn the pan spreading button to assign it to panning. Now we'll use a different frequency than LFO 3, otherwise we could have just mapped LFO 3 using the mod matrix. So now we'll use a value of like, I don't know, 42. It's a good number. And let's introduce the amount. Yeah, I like this. Now this is still sounding quite dull, there's not a lot of intensity, it's such a mellow tone when you use the triangle shape for the oscillator, but as soon as you start turning up the shape mod, you get in this really interesting harmonic sound. I'll show you. So let's use the auxiliary envelope to modulate the shape mod for both oscillators. So we'll pick the destination, oscillator all shape, set the amount to maximum just so we hear what's going on, and play with attack, decay, sustain and release. Let's see what's happening by default. I like that the sound returns to its original tone at the end of the envelope, but I wish it would start introducing these harmonics a little bit later. So I'll use the envelope delay, increase that to delay the envelope, right? And now I'll reduce the envelope amount to quite a low amount so that we only hear the first range of this shape mod. Let's also play with the noise level to add some additional harmonics to this. It's almost time to bring back the shifting rhythmic pattern with the LFOs, but first we'll add some reverb to this. So let's select the reverb effect, turn it on, set the reverb time to its maximum value because we need a huge reverb, and let's play with the tone and mix a little bit. Here we go. I just remembered one thing that I also included in the original patch, which is sort of the volume swell you get each time a chord is played. And for this we can use the envelopes for the filter and amplifier. We'll start by trying to set the attack value for both envelopes to around 50%. I think that can be a bit longer. Somewhere around 100. And this is also one of the reasons that I chose to delay the envelope for the shape mod, because now you can hear first the envelope for the filter and amplifier comes up, and after that the envelope for the shape mod is introduced. Let's also play with the release of the envelopes for the filter and amplifier. I think it can be a bit longer, like maybe 90? Alright, let's bring back the signature sound. We'll turn down the cutoff for the filter, switch to the first LFO, and set the amount to full. And I think I'm just gonna improvise a little bit now, play with the audio modulation. Oh, actually I also set the envelope amount to 0 now. I'll play with the noise, I'll play with the oscillator mix, maybe even introduce the sub-octave, and of course the amount of the first LFO. Those are the main things I'm going to be playing with. Here we go. So I think these are the most basic ingredients for this patch. It's interesting to realize that we haven't even touched the mod matrix. So there's 8 plus some mod slots that we can use to make this sound even more interesting. We could modulate parameters of the effect. We modulate some filter parameters, amplifier parameters. We have 4 LFOs set to different speeds, so there's a lot of ways we can go from this point. But I'll leave that up to you to experiment with and find some interesting combinations. As I said at the start of this video, I'd like to show you one additional alternative approach to achieving this shifting rhythmic pattern with these LFOs, and this incorporates the auxiliary envelope. The basic idea is that we'll use the third envelope like a type of LFO, which allows you to do some additional interesting things. It's easiest to just show you, so we'll just go one step at a time. First, we will kind of disable the first LFO by setting the destination to off and the amount and frequency to 0. So this one is just ignored at this point. We'll change the destination for the envelope to the filter cutoff. Let's look it up. And set the amount to its maximum value at this point. But the crucial element for this idea is to enable repeat for the third envelope. So we'll go into the parameters and scroll over to envelope 3 repeat and turn it on. Now we can change the shape of the envelope and we'll set it to values that kind of mimic the shape of the first LFO. So attack at 0, decay to, I don't know, something around noon. Sustain at 0, release I don't think matters in this situation. Delay set to 0 in case it was still up. Let's see what this sounds like. And you will notice that as soon as I start decreasing the envelope decay, we kind of get the same effect as we got with the LFO. So now we can just change the destination of the second LFO to the decay parameter of the third envelope. And we'll just hold the button, twist the knob. It actually works. Set the amount. It should be fine where it's set by default. Let's check it out. Now, as you can hear, I'm not able to exactly replicate the sound of the LFO, but I'm pretty sure it should be possible to get to the same effect. However, one of the reasons I'm exploring this idea at all is because now we have an attack portion of the envelope as well that we can play with. So let's see what kind of difference this makes. Now, I must admit, I'm not super happy with where I'm getting right now with the envelope. I didn't prepare this super well, but I just wanted to show you this and mention a few things that are interesting to keep in mind in general when working with this synth. First of all, remember when I was explaining the key sync stuff? Well, of course, with an envelope, you're always key sync, right? You're starting the shape of the envelope when you're pressing a key. So sometimes it might be interesting when you turn on key sync for an LFO to think whether it would give you even more sound design capabilities if you switched to the third envelope and turned on repeat instead, so that you have different phases that you can influence of how this shape will sound. Another aspect that I liked about this approach of using the envelope is that you have a dedicated knob for setting the amount of the typical modulation that you get from this effect. Let me show you what I mean. And the reason I'm saying it like this is because for the 4 LFOs, of course, you always need to switch LFOs, and then you can change the amount for the selected LFO, which might be a bit tricky if you're doing a performance and you have multiple LFOs changing interesting parameters. So then it might just be interesting to have first select the LFO that you're sure you want to influence, and then you can just use the envelope amount to influence that parameter. But one of the things I don't like about using the envelope for this goal is that I hope you could hear that at the end of the release of the envelope for the filter and amplifier, with the LFO method, you would still get a few ding, 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 ding. Like the shifting pattern, but with the when you're using the third envelope, this pattern just ends as soon as the envelope ends. So then I'll show you again. Right, so that's cool. When you do use the LFO for this effect, then you still get a few of those extra repeats at the end of the envelope. And the final thing I could think of that I didn't really like about using the third envelope in this way is that I really liked when we were controlling the shape mod of the oscillators with the third envelope, and we could add some delay to the third envelope, because then you would first have the attack phase of the first two envelopes that basically control volume, and then have the third envelope that adds the additional harmonics come after that. So this adds more evolving structures, I would say, in the sound design. I think that's all I wanted to say about this patch. I know it's a lot of information, but I hope you can sort of get the basic idea of how it's set up. You can find all the values for the different parameters that I've used to create this patch in this video attached to the video description. And if you have any questions or feedback on this video, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!